George. I hate to tell all of my classmates that I never ran for anything in my life or was elected to anything until I was elected to the U.S. Congress. And you may say, well, what was a non-politician like you doing running for Congress? And the answer is simple. I was out of work and needed a job. Now, that may indicate one of the key differences between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans, when they leave their private sector jobs and go into public service, always have to take a pay cut. But for Democrats, it's a promotion. Yeah, we need the work. Now, I'll admit I had some useful experience. I had taught political science in college. I had worked in Washington for the Office of Economic Opportunity under Ted's brother-in-law, Sarge Shriver. I had done some lobbying on the Hill on educational legislation for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And then I worked in state government for a governor who had been a former congressman. I spent 4 years as the coordinator of federal state programs and a special assistant to that governor. That governor, though a Democrat, had lost his seniority in the House for supporting Barry Goldwater for president in 1964. He came back. That helped him get elected governor, though. And so I ended up being what some folks have described as the federal bag man for Mississippi. That is, and my job was to get all the federal money I could and invest it wisely into specific programs. I set up things like Medicaid, comprehensive health planning, the Appalachian program, law enforcement assistance, and a whole lot of others, several dozen others. When the administrations changed and a new governor came in, another Democrat, admittedly, because that was an era when everybody was a Democrat in our governor's mansion, the new governor invited me to come over to the Capitol for a visit. And I thought, well, hey, I just may stay and make a career in the administrative side of state government because I had not been hired for political purposes. So I go into the governor's office and he says, hey, David, come on in here, man. I am just delighted to see you. He said, everywhere I went on the campaign trail last year, people told me what a terrific fellow you were, that you'd brought in hundreds of millions of dollars to our state that we wouldn't have had without you, and you did it without any hint of impropriety or taint of corruption of any kind. And I want you to stay on with me in my new administration just as long as it takes me to find a good replacement for you. So I said, Governor, I sure do appreciate that strong vote of confidence. But, you know, I think I'm going to do something a little off the wall. He said, what's that? I said, I think I'm going to run for Congress. Now, he thought that really was off the wall because some Harvard egghead college professor running for Congress in Mississippi it never happened before. But strange things do happen sometimes. So, in any event, I enjoyed my service in the Congress. I wrote a lot of farm legislation. I was a co-author of the Endangered Species Act and helped rewrite that in later years to try to achieve maybe a little better balance between the economic needs of humans and the survival of animal species. And one particularly interesting job I had was in 1979, and I happened to be on the Foreign Affairs Committee and also on the Panama Canal Subcommittee of Merchant Marine Fisheries, and because of my service on those two committees, I was asked to exercise a sort of a special leadership role in trying to get passed through the House the Panama Canal management or implementing legislation, which followed upon the Senate ratification of the Panama Canal treaties. If we had failed to pass that legislation in the House, then the U.S. would have been in default on its treaty obligations, and we would have jeopardized our ability to stay in the canal for another 20 years and administer it. So that was a role I enjoyed, and since foreign policy had always been a rather special interest of mine. And in 1980, following the census, a process began, particularly in the South, which helped transform politics in America, certainly in that region. The 82 elections came along. President Reagan's Justice Department felt that Republicans had not been treated kindly by the General Assembly of the state of California in the redistricting there. And they decided to take it out on Southern Democrats or anybody else they could. So they challenged a lot of districts. They followed a strategy which worked very well. I'm happy to say it's being reversed by the federal courts to some extent now. And that is a process of gerrymandering which involved sort of bundling the largest number of African American citizens they could into the fewest number of districts possible, which guaranteed, as they say, more black faces in Congress, but at the same time reduced the overall number of Democrats, increased the Republicans. And it's a strange kind of alliance between black Americans and the Republican Party. In the South, blacks normally were voting Democratic, but in that case, that was the strategy followed, and it seemed to be successful. I had a fairly broad-based coalition of supporters. I had businessmen on the right, people who assumed the Democrats would always run the U.S. Congress. And if you wanted to have any influence in Washington, you had to support Democrats. And I had strong black support. I also had the endorsement of organized labor. I was the first congressman from Mississippi ever elected with that support. I happened to have been the first congressman since Reconstruction in our state to hire black staff. The others in our congressional delegation followed: Stennis, Eastland, Cochran, Lott, all the rest. And so I had strong base of support in the black community. But to indicate the difficulty in holding together a broad-based coalition like that, many of my Republican friends and supporters certainly perceived that there was a real possibility, Nancy, that the Republicans could actually gain control of the House. So they began to back off just a little bit. I remember one of them summed it up pretty well. He said, David, you're a terrific fella, but you know, we can buy a Republican for the same price. And one of my black friends and supporters, he had his perspective too, which was not altogether good for me. He said, you know, Congressman, you're a terrific fella, as white folks go. So I had that little problem from both sides of my coalition. So I decided that was probably a good year not to run, and I honestly thought I would end up running probably for the Senate or governor or something else, and that, for a variety of reasons, did not happen. But I wanted to hold together the black support that I had in case I did make another race, and I honestly believed that given the fact that Mississippi was a state with the highest percentage of black voters in the country, it was reasonable to have a black congressman. My district was chosen for that honor. But that's the situation I faced, so that's how I happened to leave politics. And I think probably it's worthwhile to take a moment, and instead of looking back just 10 or 20 years, to look back a little further to when we were undergraduates here at Harvard College, and to ask ourselves to what extent our politics may have changed, been modified. You know, there's always been a kind of a standard view that college students, at least that was the view 50 years ago, that college students were more liberal, they were more idealistic. As my Republican friends would say, they believed in spending other people's money for worthy causes. And but as they grew older, got more responsibilities, had children, paid taxes, do all those things, they became more conservative. Now, I think that's been to some extent reversed in our country. I think probably college students are more conservative than they used to be. Whether they become more liberal as they get older, that I don't know, and I hope somebody, maybe the Crimson or some honors thesis researcher here, may come up with a few answers on that. But as I look back, and George, in introducing me, mentioned I belong to the Harvard Liberal Union. Living in G entry of Lowell House, 5 feet away from me, was Tony Bielenson at this table on the panel, who was also a member of the Harvard Liberal Union, and who would have thought the two of us would have been elected to Congress. And indeed, I don't know whether we've had any other class that had 4 members of the class who were in Congress. But as I look back at my views, I don't think probably I have changed too much in my economic or political or foreign policy views. I probably, to some extent, would have been considered liberal then and liberal now. At that time, I wanted to have some comprehensive health care system for the country. You know, back then they called that socialized medicine, and they may still do, some do. but I still think that should be the case. I'm enjoying my Medicare so much, I wish everybody else had the benefits of it. Or perhaps Medicaid even better. Or in any event, and in foreign policy, I'm not very happy about the bellicose, expansionist, neocon policy in some circles in Washington. As they like to describe it, America must project our power and impose our will around the world. I don't happen to share that view, but in any event, I don't think my opinions have changed much. Now, in one particular area, that of what today is called social and cultural policy, I may have become slightly more conservative, but it's a matter of terminology more than anything else. For example, I fought so long and so hard to end discrimination where white people were the beneficiaries that I am not personally prepared to replace it with a kind of discrimination where some other or group or minority is the beneficiary. I happen to feel that equal opportunity and equal rights is something that should be applied fairly across the board, and I do not think that compensating individuals whose ancestors may well have suffered in some way, have been victims of discrimination, is the best way to run our nation. So I think we are probably moving in that direction. Another thing that disturbs me in our society today, and I asked one of the deans in the previous panel whether that's being practiced here at Harvard, and I think I got an assurance that that's not the case, and that's what on some campuses are called speech codes, repressive speech codes, in which people attempt to restrict what is being said or written or what faculty members can say in order to ensure that certain people do not hear things they do not like to hear, or that they disagree with, or that they find irritating or offensive. So that's perhaps a way in which I might have become a little more conservative, but I don't really consider that conservative. I consider that a broadly liberal concept. And then to conclude, an issue which is one of the hottest and most sensitive today, that of gay marriage. I do not plan to comment on that, on its merits, which is a personal matter. I would like to say, though, that I think I have probably become a greater believer in judicial restraint rather than judicial activism over the last 50 years. I think if the Commonwealth of Massachusetts wishes to legalize gay marriage or marriage between adults and children under whatever, 10, 12, 14, 15, I'm not sure what the age of marriage is in this state, or legalize polygamy or polyandry or anything else that's not currently allowable under law. I think that's the business of this state and any state. But I think that should be done through the legislative process. I'd like to see it addressed in that way. I think since we purport to set up a standard for the world in terms of the practice of democracy, I hate to see us abandon a democratic process and replace it with a judicial process. Certainly legislatures make mistakes too, just as judicial bodies do. But I happen to believe legislative mistakes are more easily corrected than judicial mistakes. So that's where I stand on that. Let me close by saying something which I think might be guidance for all of us, especially on this panel, and that is when I was flying up here from Mississippi, I chatted with a woman who seemed to have her priorities in order. She asked me what I was doing up here, and I said, I'm coming up to Harvard to a class reunion, and then I proceeded to give her about 10 minutes on the wonders and glories of the U.S. Congress and my service there and what we do and all that. And after all that talk, she concluded by saying, you have no idea how thrilled I am to meet you. You know, this is the first time in my life I ever met a real live Harvard graduate.